Wonderful. Let's get started. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining. My name is Scott Baldwin. I'm the community lead and product evangelist here at Productboard and the product makers community. And I really appreciate you joining us today, taking time out of your schedule. A few housekeeping items just to get us started really quickly here. We will be recording today's session. So if you have to leave early, miss some of it, or want to share it with some of your friends and colleagues, it will be available shortly after the event within our product makers community. You can look for that event recap topic in our past event section, which is available right in the top navigation bar of the site. We will be utilizing Q&A for questions today, chat for chat. So if you want to have any banter along the way, feel free to chime in. We'd love to have you keep this interactive and engaging. And any kind of post-session questions, you can feel free to utilize the QA for that. That'd be great. And I'm super excited to have Michele Hansen joining me today. Michelle's a co-founder of Geocodio, an independent SaaS. She was the product manager prior to that at the Motley Fool. Oh, wow, that's pretty exciting times. And she's the co-host of the Software Social podcast and author of a really fantastic book, which I'll hold up here, called Deploy Empathy. It's a practical guide to interviewing customers, and full of hot tips, great information, and I think we'll actually make probably one of the better companions around this topic on your bedside table or your book stand. So I encourage you to pick up a copy of that. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Michele, and we'll get started with things.
Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to be talking to you today about troubleshooting user interviews. As Scott mentioned, as we're going through this, feel free to just chime in with questions, but we will also have time for questions at the end. So I'm going to pull up my slides now. There we go. Are they? Okay. Can you see my slides?
No problems.
Okay, cool. Let's get started. So, troubleshooting interviews. If you have done customer interviews, you have probably had something go wrong. In fact, there is an entertaining book all about things going wrong in user interviews from Steve Portigal that is a really interesting read focused on in-person interviews. I think that's Doorbells, Dead Batteries, really fun book. But so today we're going to be talking about troubleshooting some common issues. But first, just a little on me. So as Scott mentioned, I'm the co-founder of Geocodio, which is a SaaS that we started 8 years ago. And I'm also, when I'm talking about all this, I'm talking about it as a current practitioner in a SaaS company. I am also the co-host of Software Social, which is a podcast about running and starting SaaS companies. And then what brings us to today is that I am the author of Deploy Empathy, which is a practical guide to interviewing customers that came out of my work mentoring other founders and finding that I wished I had one resource I could send people to that kind of pulled together the big jumble of resources that I was sending to them. So I started writing a newsletter, and then that turned into a book. So some common challenges that people have with customer interviews that we're going to go through today. There are other challenges, and feel free to bring those up afterwards. But here's the ones we're going to talk about today. Finding participants, no-shows, figuring out whether you should give an incentive or not, which questions to ask, dealing with awkward silences, unexpected guests, which is you think you're interviewing one person and then the whole team shows up. They start talking about something off topic or changing the topic, and then your interviews are either too short or they're too long. So this first one, so the most common thing, especially in a larger company, is to use a recruiting agency. Or perhaps if you already have customers, you can recruit from your email list. But if that isn't really working, I suggest that you get your hands dirty and start hunting around for where your customers or potential customers are hanging out. Amy Hoy describes this as digital watering holes. So going and finding subreddits and Facebook groups, seeing what people are searching for on Twitter. People often think that you can't find enterprise software users, especially on Reddit or on Twitter, but you can. I've done this for my own products. And I mean, selling enterprise software. So you can find people there. And I find it's a little bit more personal. And so sometimes it can be easier that you have to make sure that you're following the rules of that community and making sure that it's allowed. And one thing that I found really helps for recruiting people is to include your incentive in the title. I have generally found that a $25 Amazon gift card or corresponding for your country, both in terms of currency and locale, so to speak, is about the right thing. It's basically like what is the equivalent of a nice sit down lunch? So maybe that's 20 euro or 30 Canadian dollars, whatever that might be. And a big focus of my book is providing templates for you to build off of for your own posts, because I find this is a big barrier for people is, okay, I know I should go to Reddit and post something, but like, what is an actual post that I can start with that I can do and adapt for your own purposes. So for example, if you find a nice little niche subreddit related to those users or where people are talking about it, we're looking to talk to people who've recently purchased a used car, $25 Amazon gift card for participating. Or you can reply to a tweet with something similar. If you're emailing existing customers, I find that often they don't want a monetary incentive. The social dynamic there is different, and it's more like they're doing a favor for you rather than you doing a favor. You're doing them a favor by listening to them rather than the other way around. So I have actually found that just telling them that they could potentially influence your roadmap is a huge incentive. It doesn't mean they're actually going to get to influence it, but the idea that they could, get your ear and tell you all of these ideas that they have and all these problems they have with your product is a really strong incentive for them. Former customers, however, you definitely need to monetarily incentivize them. With existing customers, you can also give them swag. Definitely don't do that for former customers because they might take it as you trying to subtly get them back, and you want to avoid that. So the next one, but I guess before I move on, any questions about that? And feel free to just chime in. I see we have two things in the chat. Okay, I'm going to continue then. So no shows. So this is a really tough one. I mean, I especially when I was a product manager, we had a lot of no shows. And what I have learned since then is that it's really helpful to have some sort of personal connection to the person you're going to talk to, even if you're not the one doing the recruiting yourself. So for example, when I was a product manager, we had someone on our team who was doing the recruiting and setting everything up, making sure the incentives were sent, all of that, which was really helpful. But we still had no shows. And then I noticed that when and now I'm a founder and I've been interviewing people as the founder of my company for 5 years now, my no-show rate basically dropped to 0. And so something really important here is that it is easier. It is harder to disappoint a known individual than a faceless user research recruiter. This is from Cindy Alvarez's fantastic book, Lean Customer Development. And so make sure you have some sort of personal connection to them. For example, you could invent a title. So maybe your title is product manager, but you want to sound important. You want to sound like you are somebody who has say over things, and that if they talk to you, that their ideas will be taken into consideration. And so if you happen to dub yourself the head of customer research, if you don't have that in your organization, or whatever that is, just invent a title that makes you sound very important, and people will be more likely to show up. But at the very least, send them a personal reminder beforehand, say that you're looking forward to talking to them. It doesn't have to be very long. So we mentioned incentives a little bit before. I think it's really important to think about the social dynamics going on. So if you are interviewing someone that you have randomly found on the internet, they've talked about a problem on Reddit or Facebook or Twitter that relates to your product or a product you would like to build, and you ask them to do a phone call, they are doing you a favor. And so in which case it is definitely appropriate to provide them with a monetary incentive for something that is not your product. For existing customers, for example, if you're trying to interview your long-term happy customers to figure out why they're happy so you can get more people in who are also going to be happy with similar use cases, then you can consider giving them swag or maybe a product credit of some sort. When I started out doing this, probably for the first year or so, we gave them Amazon gift cards as well. And I found that 9 times out of 10, they rejected it. They found it awkward because, again, it felt like we were doing them a favor. And it wasn't until one day when somebody was like, no, but I would love a hat. And that's really interesting because people who've been a customer for, more than a couple of months, they probably have some sort of affiliation for your product. And so I find that swag is a really good incentive for them, or it's also more of a thank you gift as well. And pairing that with a personalized mailed thank you note is just like, you can't get better than that. They will love you. For former customers, you have to do the gift cards. Swag or product credits will make them think that you're just trying to convert them back, and it can just get messy. Just take it from me. Don't do that. The other great thing about when you interview a customer and you send them swag is they will wear it. For example, here are some socks that I sent to a customer of ours, and he ended up tweeting about it, which, so that one interview, which I learned so much from him about their experience and what they're trying to do and how geocoding fits into it and how we fit into it. I sent him a pair of socks, a sticker, and a thank you note afterwards. And then one day we saw this on Twitter. And so it helps share your company. So even if the point of your interviews isn't marketing, they can actually end up working as that. I find that the customers I've interviewed, they are the ones who are talking us up to people. They are the ones posting about us on Twitter, online. They become really strong advocates for our company. And I think that's because, in this day and age when we're so used to just massive companies that don't really feel like listen to people, and, we've all been on a hold with an airline for hours on end, right? Like you don't feel like you get treated as an individual, as a person by companies. To have somebody from a company spend half an hour or an hour with you trying to really understand what you're trying to do is really powerful. So coming up with questions. This is another common thing that people think about. There are some scripts in various books. I know that Jim Kobach's book, The Jobs to be Done Playbook, has some good scripts at the end of it. I also have a whole part of my book devoted to them as well. And one thing I suggest doing that when you have a script and taking an existing script and working with it is workshopping it, which is basically testing it within your team, doing sample interviews with one another, making sure that there's good flow in the questions. This is something that they do every time before they do user interviews at Stripe. I talked to Theodora Chu, a product manager at Stripe, for my book, and she said that the workshopping process results in a script that almost anyone can run with and go talk to users and get high quality signal. So I have been interviewed by Stripe, which is actually how I ended up interviewing Theo for my book. And I was struck by how there were developers doing the interviewing when I was talking to them. And so this process is of really just making sure that the script works. It really works. But I don't suggest starting from scratch. That could probably feel a little bit overwhelming. So start with a template, whether those are the 6 templates in my book, ranging from everything from the early stage of evaluating an idea to longtime customers, people who recently purchased, former customers, doing an interactive interview, which is kind of, I feel like it's kind of a hybrid between usability testing, but also interviewing, where you basically have something up there as a prop that you can talk about, and also doing card sorting interviews. Just build off of something. Don't reinvent the wheel, and just adapt them to your purposes. So the next one, so awkward silences. I think we've all been on something where the person will go, "Are you still there?" And so for that, the first thing is it's really helpful to calibrate your conversation style first. So the linguist, Dr. Deborah Tannen, she has done a lot of research on different regional conversation styles. And she has found that, for example, in order to show engagement and interest in what someone is saying, people from the Northeast, which is where I'm from, will tend to talk over one another and interrupt one another as a way to show that they're engaged. By contrast, somebody from California or East Asia will wait and pause until the other person is done speaking. And so it's helpful to calibrate what your conversation style is first. If you are a cooperative overlapping person, as she describes it, and there's an awkward silence in your interview, you might perceive an awkward silence where the person you're talking to doesn't. And I often think of some advice that I got from somebody who used to work for Terry Gross, the NPR interview show host, which is that she would ask a question, or she asks a question, and then she waits 3 beats until it's awkward. And the interviewee will fill that space with what is usually the most interesting part of the interview. And so I suggest just noticing, like, how are you in a conversation with someone when you're really excited about what you're talking about? Are you interrupting with them? Are you engaging with them? Are you finishing their sentences? Or are you someone who is more so going to pause? You don't have to change your default conversation style, but in an interview, it's helpful to know what that is and to add more pausing into your conversation. Because if you interrupt someone, that will shut them down. Now, if they say, "Are you still there?" It's really helpful to have a bank of fallback prompts that you can use. And I like to use ones that complement them. So if they say that, and I might say, for example, "Oh, I was just jotting down that last thing you said. That sounded really important. Could you say more about how you send those invoices?" Or something that says that you're being deferential to them, because we want to elevate them to the position of teacher. For example, "Oh, yes, I'm here. I was just giving you a moment to think." Have these ready. So I always suggest printing out a script and leaving several carriage returns in between each question to give yourself space to jot things down. But you might find it helpful to have a list of prompts to give if things get awkward, a list of validating statements to encourage them to keep talking, just so that you don't have to be sort of stumbling yourself over in the moment, and you can look down on your paper and have something to say. But one reason it might be awkward is because they don't feel like they are allowed to share things with you. So consider the dynamics of the conversation. If the person is it's not just awkward, but they're being kind of cagey and not really giving you any detail, it's okay to kind of recalibrate and pause and say, I'm getting the sense that you may not be able to share as much information with me as you might want to. I'm just wondering, like, would it make you feel more comfortable, or your company more comfortable, if we signed an NDA first? Just so that they know that that is an option. Now, if they start talking about something off topic, I feel like this always happens. I've had people start telling me about their cat, or what they were making for dinner that day, their vacation that they're planning, to things that are kind of related, but definitely still off topic for what you're exploring. And to what I was saying earlier about having fallback prompts that complement them, I suggest redirecting them in a way, again, that complements them, and pivoting the conversation. So the first way, the best way to prevent things from getting off topic is to give them a chance to ask you questions in the beginning. It could turn out that there is a misalignment of understanding and they think they're getting on this call to get onboarding information or information about their upcoming renewal or whatever that is. And so I find it's helpful to just clear the air in the beginning and just say, but before we get started, do you have any questions for me? And again, give them that long pause so that they know that they have the floor. But if they start talking about something and you want to get it back on track, don't cut them off. Wait for a pause and then say, I was just looking at my notes. Earlier, you said something about how you send those invoices. I'm wondering, could we just go back to that? Right? Like find a way that complements what they said, right? Because if you say that you're looking at your notes, you're saying that what they said was important, that you're paying attention to them, that they're the one who is leading this conversation. You can also use validation in that. So for example, I can see how that's really challenging for you. Thank you for telling me that. To help me pull this whole story together, I'm wondering, could you go and tell me a little bit about, something else, right? So in that case, we used a validating statement in the beginning. Very often people want to share feature ideas, especially if it's an existing customer. And they might get really excited about the specifics of how they think this feature should work. And like you would with your executives who maybe come to you with their latest shiny object idea for something and you're protecting your team, you say something to the effect of, thank you for sharing that idea with me. Could you just like give me the kind of the big picture on where that's coming from and tell me a little bit about like what you're currently doing to get that done, right? So you're saying it's a good idea. You're not saying anything about the quality of the idea, but you're trying to understand, what is the core of that idea? Like I like to think of ideas as a box, right? If you picture a box, and then the box actually has two pieces in it. There's the problem being solved, and then there is the expression of that idea in terms of a solution. And it's really helpful to pull out the solution and just think about the problem. So then you can be exposed to all of the many different ways that problem could be solved. Now, sometimes you really want to pivot an interview because it turns out that you went in hoping to talk about one thing, and then it turns out they start talking about something else that actually seems like an even bigger opportunity. And I think this is where your judgment as an interviewer, as a product manager will really come in handy, because then you can get a sense for, wait, like strategically, this actually might be more interesting. I often find that people tell me things about why they're using our product that I haven't ever heard before. And I've been in this business for 8 years and interviewed thousands of people. I love those surprises. In some ways, I think that they're some of the best parts of interviews. And so sometimes it's okay to kind of ditch your script a little bit and go off in that other direction. Now, a really common problem, especially when you're first getting started with interviews, is that your interviews are either too long or too short. This is a problem that my Software Social co-host, Colleen Schnettler, had when she was first interviewing early users of her SaaS. And she found that the calls were like 10 or 15 minutes. And she was kind of frustrated because she was like, why is this, like, I have this script. I was so excited to talk to these people. I really wanted to learn from them. And she knew what they were talking about. And so she wasn't asking for clarification. And so they would describe something and she'd say, yep, that makes sense, and then move on to the next question. But if you're in the early stages of something or you're trying to figure out why something isn't working, we have to remember that the purpose of the interview is to understand what their experience is and their perspective of it. And if we assume too much about what they're talking about, or we assume our own experience on what they're saying, then we're not going to get that information that can really help our company. And so I like to use a trick about asking for clarification even when you don't need it. So for example, if they said, so first if I want to get a new vendor, for example, first I have to send a PO and, oh, sorry, wait, I said that wrong. First, I have to ask my manager for permission, and then I have to go to purchasing to get a PO, and then I send that back to the vendor. And you might say, yeah, that makes sense, and move on to the next question. But if you really want to understand how these things work within their organization, you could rephrase it back to them by saying, so let me just get this straight. First, you go to your manager, then you go to purchasing, and then you get the PO that you can send to the vendor. If you really want to get a lot of detail, you can rephrase what they're saying slightly wrong, because when we're correcting someone, we tend to over-explain and go in more detail. And people over-explaining and going in more detail is exactly what we want out of an interview. So you could say, for example, let me just make sure I understand the process for getting a new vendor on board. First, you go to purchasing, then you go to your manager, and then you have a PO that you can bring back to the vendor. There's just one slight change in the process described, but that'll be enough for them to jump in and say, no. So first I have to go talk to my manager. And then usually that takes like a week, and they have to get their approval, and we have to use the system for it. And then I go talk to purchasing, and like sometimes we have to get legal involved, like, right? Like you're going to get a lot more detail back from them because they're going to over explain. And this is so helpful because we want to elevate them to the position of teacher, so that they will teach us everything about their experience of the problem. But maybe you have a problem where they're going too long. This is where I find it helpful to have a script and also a plan. And this plan just might be in your head, or maybe it's something you've jotted down on your script. But for example, here is an example plan for an interview. So for a 30-minute interview, first 5 minutes is the intro and their questions. Your questions, the first 15 minutes, doing the reaching for the door question at 20 minutes, which is sort of a fake out to ending the interview, and then wrapping up. This reaching for the door question is the most important question that I ask in any interview. And basically the first part of that interview, when you're asking the questions on your script, yes, you're getting answers to your questions, but more so you're building rapport with them. You're opening them up about the topic. You're showing them that you genuinely care about this process that they go through, that they probably have never talked through with anyone else. And if this is a frequent and painful problem, the fact that they're doing this frequently and haven't ever talked about it to someone is going to be very moving for them. And so basically you're building rapport by the way you're listening to them. And so the reaching for the door question is, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it. I've learned a lot from you today. Is there anything else you think I should know? And you wait until that pause is awkward. And then they will fill it, as Terry Gross said, with the most interesting parts of the interview, because their mind is going on the topic. They trust that you're listening to them. And this is when I find the best things come out in an interview, even in interviews where I felt like I was pulling blood from a stone and wasn't getting anything out of it. It really turns the tide at that point. For a 1-hour interview, I plan that my questions are done by about the 30-minute mark. And then I ask that reaching for the door question. But also, remember, if you've built rapport with someone, that they know that you care about what they're saying, what they're going through, and that you're listening to them, you can always reach out to them later, right? You might say this in your goodbye of, is it okay if I reach out to you in the future if I have any follow-up questions? And if you have treated them well, chances are they will say yes. So don't worry if you don't get every single one of your questions answered. That's okay. And really this ties into the whole theme of the book, which is picturing yourself as a rubber duck. So you may have read the book, The Pragmatic Programmer, where they suggest that programmers keep a rubber duck on their desk to talk to whenever they run into a problem. I put a spin on that is you should picture yourself as the rubber duck that they are talking to. You are there to reflect and encourage what they're saying. Of course, you are leading the conversation in a certain direction, but really you are there to actively listen to what they are saying and to make them comfortable talking about this. So that wraps up the slides that I had, and I would love to dive into questions and challenges that you've had.
That is awesome. Thanks so much for this. Really, really great. Pure gold, as somebody mentioned here, which is great to see.
Thank you, Carolina.
Excellent to see. Some great tips. we're going to leave some time maybe for Q&A. So again, folks, if you do have some questions for Michele, we'd love to hear them. We'd like to keep this really interactive. Feel free to utilize the Q&A function, and we'll jump in with some responses on that side. We've got a first one here coming in from David. Thanks, David, for sharing. How can interviews provide an opportunity for the interviewee to know themselves more? Well, that's an interesting one.
So are you basically saying like give the interviewees an opportunity to understand their own process better? Are we allowed, can David be
yeah, he can chime in with further
on
details.
Screen? Yeah, David, can you
I don't know if I can get him on screen, but let me just see if I can do that for you. 2 seconds.
or give him
I can make him, allow him to talk. So give me a second.
Okay.
Go ahead and talk. I can bring him on here.
All right. Hi, how are you?
Hi.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I've learned a lot. Now, in my experience, one of the goals I've always had is to help the interviewers leave the session knowing a bit more about not only their processes, but even perhaps the core reason why they're experiencing these gaps, because I've observed that sometimes they're really surprised to realize that the surface level problem had a deeper reason. And when they're able to understand the deeper reason, I find that it derives more satisfaction, but I don't know what that is that enables them to actually discover a part of themselves a bit more, so they leave more self-aware. So yeah.
I think I think it would be helpful in that case to follow up with them via email later. So maybe a couple of days later, sort of the day after, or even later that day, sending them a simple thank you email for having the call. But then even if you're on the call and you have the sense of like, oh, there's a bigger problem here and I really should tell them about it. Of course, you can't tell them that on the call, as you seem to understand. But instead you can follow up with them later, right? So like maybe a couple days or a week later and say, hey, David, thank you so much for having that call with me last week. I really enjoyed our conversation. I was thinking about it more, and I was wondering whether you've considered X, Y, and Z, and kind of go into it there in an email form, and doing it in a very, very polite way of, using sort of very padded phrasing, things like, I wondered, or, it got me curious about, whether you've thought about this or that, or something like that. But even if it's something about, sometimes people ask about, like issues, they had a support issue related to the product, or they had questions about a specific feature, right? And you can't really get into that at that time. Then just following up via email is something you can do. And again, if you've built that rapport with them, they, and they've said that you can email them in the future, then they should be open to that. But just, also be careful giving them advice that's unsolicited.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
No problem. Thank you, David. I'll shoot over to another one here from Valerie. If you're having a great interview with someone and it's going over, how much time is appropriate to ask them for a follow-up? Can we interview them again?
Yes. So if something is going really great and the person really wants to talk, and I'm getting a lot of really good information and everything is really, really good, and I'm looking at the clock and it's 27 minutes on a half-hour interview or 55 minutes on an hour interview, I would, the next sort of break in the conversation, I would say something to the effect of, I'm really enjoying talking to you about this. I want to be conscious of your time though. I had promised you that this would be half an hour or an hour, and that's coming up in a couple of minutes. So I wanted to just check in. Do you have time to continue this conversation right now, if you have time, or can we schedule another time to pick up this conversation? So just, I think, giving them a warning before you hit the time, if you can, it is the way to handle that.
It's really good advice. Good tip. Sarah has a question. I would love to know how you navigate conversations in remote interviews. I guess particularly where folks always have their cameras off. How do you deal with that?
So I actually prefer doing remote interviews. I got my start doing phone interviews. And actually when I send people invitations to do an interview, I will often just only send them the call-in phone number, because when you remove the visual element from it, it's actually easier for you as an interviewer because you only have voice to pay attention to. You don't have to be paying attention to their body language, and you don't have to be paying attention to your body language, right? Because if I'm just talking and I don't see the other person on the other side, it's easier to forget that they're a person, which makes you more open, right? But if I'm talking and I can see Scott's nodding right now, or he's looking at me, he's frowning, but maybe he's not frowning, that's just like his face, or, right? Like I might be like, oh no, like, is he mad at me? Am I saying the wrong thing? Or if I see him shifting or drinking water, right? And so it's actually a lot easier to do a remote interview with no camera on. And especially if you're starting out, I would strongly suggest that your interviews are no camera. And I find that even when I say that for meetings that I didn't schedule, just general meetings, and I say, oh, like, can we just go camera off? Like I like to walk during meetings. People usually go, oh, thank God, me too. Like, I feel like at this point, everybody is relieved to not be on camera. But of course, sometimes you really need to be on camera. So if you're doing a usability test or you're doing an interactive interview, you want to understand why a landing page isn't converting or why people aren't using a feature. Then you need to have video enabled, but you don't necessarily have to have the camera enabled. You just need to be able to see their screen. And so I encourage you to only use video when you really, really need to, like, and you need to see them interacting with something. I would say default to video off.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good one. I've also, I think, had pretty good success, like sometimes pairing up in those video situations. I don't know if you've had any kind of experience on that side as well, where like having two interviewers in the room, one who's maybe paying more attention to the body language and taking notes, and one who's kind of maybe more paying attention to the conversation or discussion and taking notes, or just running the interview itself. I don't know if you have any kind of ways in which to break that up too when you're dealing with video to be successful in video.
Yeah, so I mean, when I was a product manager, I was in a much larger organization, and we always did pair interviews, and we also often had, especially if it was a phone call, we would have relevant stakeholders just sitting in the room as observers, which was so powerful for when we finally came to them with results. It wasn't just sort of showing up out of nowhere, right? Because they really felt bought in because they had been in the room when the interview was happening, or they had been in the room cheering for the user to find the button in the usability test, and then they didn't. And then so we go to the board and say, we've got to make it so people can find this button. They're like, yes, I get it. No need for further explanation. And so, yeah, and so having a note taker is really helpful when you have a pair, a lead interviewer, and then maybe someone who only asks a couple of questions at specific moments. Maybe one person does the main questions and then one person handles the part after the reaching for the door question. Taking notes and observing on what you can that's relevant, but really where you can, I suggest that you do them remotely. It also reduces opportunities for unconscious bias and making any sort of assumptions about our interviewee based on what we can see on screen.
That's great. Another question here from, oh, go ahead.
No, I'm good.
All right. Okay. Another question from Hilda here. Could you expand on the rubber duck metaphor? And thank you very much for this very rich presentation, she said.
Thank you, Hilda. So the rubber duck metaphor, originally, as I mentioned, originally comes from the book, The Pragmatic Programmer. And so it's basically this idea that programmers should talk to the duck and talk out a problem to the duck in order to figure out what the source of the problem was. And I realized, some years ago that this was actually really relevant to user interviews. So, I come from a product background. My husband, who's my co-founder, he's a developer. And, there would be times when we would be talking through a really complicated technical issue about, infrastructure or whatnot that was definitely out of my wheelhouse. But I was, so I was like, my role in this conversation is not to tell him what to do or to give him advice on load balancing or, memory or whatever it is. But to just help him figure out what the solution is by asking questions back at him about why he was doing certain things, why he was making certain assumptions, that he was making certain assumptions, and saying, okay, so it sounds like you're assuming that this would happen. and then just letting him talk and figure it out.
Mhm.
And I connected this to user interviews a couple of years ago, and I realized it's actually the same set of skills. Me picturing myself as that rubber duck in that conversation, but then also when I'm in a user interview, of course, I'm getting us started on a topic. I want to understand, for example, why they even need geocoding and adding that additional data in the first place. I like to say that geocoding, it's not like stamps. Nobody collects latitude and longitude for the fun of it. You're trying to do something else with it. And so you're setting up that conversation, you're leading that conversation, but it should more so feel like they're leading it, and you're saying, okay, so it sounds like you're trying to connect that data to this other piece of data, but when you're trying to normalize all the data, it takes a lot of time, right? I know a whole lot about how normalizing data you're pulling from multiple sources takes a lot of time, but I want to hear their experience about it. And so kind of picturing yourself as that rubber duck that is just there to reflect their experience back to them in a sort of strategic way that is relevant to what you're trying to do is really helpful. And it reminds me that it's not a conversation. Like, interviews are not a conversation. They're not like an interview that you would have as a job interview or as a journalistic interview. They're like a form of acting. They're almost like improv, where you're just trying to build on whatever they're saying in that particular direction. And so I find it helpful if I'm sitting there and I find my own conversation instincts coming out and being like, and I want to be like, oh yeah, I feel that too. Like, yeah, that's a really big problem. Instead saying, oh, so it sounds like that's a really big problem for you, right? Refocusing it on them, that the purpose is them talking.
Yeah, that's great. Another question here from David. Thanks again, David, for sharing a question. How could pen and paper in the hands of the interviewee help them better express their answers and feedback? Could it help visual thinkers share their experiences better?
1,000%. That's such a good question, David. One of my favorite reasons for having my printed out scripts is that I often flip the page over. I intentionally print them as single-sided so that I can flip the page over and I start, if I start hearing, a buying journey with a first thought and all these different things, I can just start diagramming that out. If they're explaining something to me that it makes sense in a grid format or in a graph format, or there's different things going on, I can start drawing it right away. And then that really helps me say, okay, so it sounds like, you first started thinking about buying a new pair of sneakers when your friend mentioned that yours had a hole in them. Is that right? Right? Like, that really gives you those follow-up questions. Of course, not everyone is a visual thinker or someone who draws things out. I'm actually terrible at art and I don't draw and I do this. But I find that really helpful to have that physical script printed out. And it can also help keep you on track, right? Because then you can have the diagrams that you've been drawing where you're diagramming their thinking next to the questions you had, and then remembering that, okay, they're telling me about, like, they started talking about the shoes, and you can say, can you just walk me through, like, who else was involved in this decision to buy these shoes, right? So you can ping pong from their system of thinking about the problem to your questions and the things that will help accomplish your goals.
I wonder if David's thinking here a little bit more about getting the interviewee to draw, or the interviewee
Oh,
like. So I guess maybe to answer the question on both angles, like whether maybe getting them up at a whiteboard or having kind of a bit of a collaboration a little bit could be a great way to get to the same answer, but maybe not in a textual way in terms of the feedback that's coming about, or verbal.
Yeah, so I think that's a really great thing to do for an interactive interview. So, I often talk about this in terms of like websites. But if you have, for example, if you are interviewing an internal stakeholder about a new prototype you're thinking of building, going to them with a piece of paper that has something already on it and saying, this is just a wireframe, it's really early, we're hoping to get your feedback, you can feel free to draw on this or whatever as you want as we talk, right? And making it very clear that whatever you're presenting to them is a draft, so that they feel like they have permission to do it, even if it's like something that's been on your website for 2 years and is very much not a draft, right? So that they feel like they have that permission to change it. I don't think I would sit them down with a blank piece of paper, because then they might feel pressure in terms of how they draw it, or that they have to draw something, or that it has to be presented in a certain way. But especially if you're talking to people internally and you're like, okay, I'm hoping to learn more about our process to procure new software. I have this little timeline right here that isn't filled in. As we're talking, if you find it helpful to just jot down what those steps are, feel free to do so, but you don't have to, right? So you can have it be an offer, but I wouldn't give them necessarily a blank piece of paper. I would give them something that is directionally relevant to what you're trying to learn.
Yeah, that's great. I don't know, any other questions anybody has? We're 10 minutes to. We're happy to take another 5 minutes or so if anybody has anything they want to share or ask. If not, we can wrap things up and let people get on with their days. Looks like that's it for questions at the moment. Well, we got another one coming in. Thanks for the deep dive. No problem, David.
Thank you, David. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everybody. So with that, maybe I'll jump over to just wrap things up and close things out. Thanks again, Michelle, for that. It was really awesome as a session. So I have shared within the chat just a quick post-event survey link. We'd love to get your feedback on this. I know Michelle would love to hear your feedback as well. We do share it with our presenters, so feel free to pass that along, and we will enter you in our prize draw as well for things based on the feedback. A little bit of an incentive there. Continuing the conversation, if you have additional questions you want to ask or things you want to learn about related to this, feel free to open up a new topic inside our community and continue the conversation there. And we've got some great events coming up. May 26th, we've got Stefan and Daniel from our product board team talking about aligning CS and product teams to maximize the impact for customers. So it'll be a great session to understand if you've got a really good or bad relationship between those two teams and how to work best together, focused again on the needs of the customer. We've got our upcoming mini conference on May 31st, June 1st, and June 2nd. These are 4 half-hour sessions per day, 12 fantastic speakers, and we have over 700 people almost signed up for this so far, which is really great to see. So feel free to come out for those sessions. Japna Sethi from our product board team as well is talking about product-led growth on June the 9th. And then we have the amazing Christian Crumlish, author of the fantastic book, Product Management for UX People, coming back to do a session called Super Friends, between that relationship between UX and product managers. So if you're interested in joining us for that, that'd be great. Lots of other great ways to get involved in our community as well, whether it be roundtables that we do monthly, whether that's our Meet a Maker program where you can connect one-to-one with other people in our community, or if you want to be a Michelle and get up here and share your knowledge and experiences, we'd love to have you. We're particularly interested in encouraging first-time speakers, those maybe in underrepresented groups, to sign up as well, and really interested in diverse opinions and voices and stuff on the practice of product. Again, Michelle, thank you very much for everything today. Really appreciate you taking the time, and I hope the reno goes well with the barn, as you remember, or the chicken shack or hen house, I think it was. Really excited to see the final product of your great workspace there. And again, thank you everybody for joining us today and for being part of this.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone.